Every single day, roughly 100 million people around the world reach for a small white tablet to kill a headache, thin their blood, or keep their heart from giving out. Most of them have no idea that this pill, the most widely consumed medicine in human history, traces its origin back to the bark of a tree that grows wild along riverbanks and wetlands on nearly every continent. A tree that ancient civilizations figured out could stop pain almost instantly. What nobody knew for most of human history was why it worked. For 5,000 years, healers, shamans, monks, and physicians all agreed on one thing: chew the bark of the willow tree and your pain goes away. They just couldn't explain the chemistry behind it. That mystery would take millennia to solve, and the answer would launch one of the largest pharmaceutical empires the world has ever seen. The banks of the Euphrates River, roughly 3,500 BC, Sumerian scribes in ancient Mesopotamia pressed the tip of a reed stylus into wet clay, recording what we now recognize as some of the earliest medical instructions ever written. Among the remedies carved into those small clay tablets was a prescription involving the bark of the willow tree ground into a paste and applied to aching joints and swollen limbs. These Sumerians didn't have laboratories or peer-reviewed journals. What they had was observation and thousands of years of trial and error along the flat, sun-baked riverbanks where willow trees grew thick and plentiful beside the slow-moving water. The thing about willow trees is that they aren't rare or exotic. They aren't some hidden jungle plant that takes an expedition to find. The white willow, the crack willow, the weeping willow. These species thrived in exactly the kinds of wet, marshy environments where early civilizations built their first cities. Along rivers, near floodplains, beside irrigation canals. If you were farming in the ancient world, you were probably within walking distance of a willow tree. And if you had a toothache that was keeping you up at night, eventually somebody was going to start chewing on whatever was nearby. That's essentially what happened, not once, but independently across nearly every major civilization on the planet. Roughly 2,000 years after those Sumerian tablets were pressed into clay, Egyptian physicians across the desert in the Nile River Valley were writing their own prescriptions on papyrus scrolls. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BC and discovered in a tomb near the ancient city of Luxor in 1872, is one of the oldest and most complete medical documents ever found. It runs over 20 meters long, roughly the length of a bowling lane, and contains more than 700 remedies for everything from eye disease to crocodile bites. And right there among the spells and surgical instructions, Egyptian doctors recommended willow leaves and bark for reducing inflammation and easing the pain of swollen joints. They would brew the bark into a tea or grind it into a thick poultice and press it against the skin, sometimes mixing it with honey to make the bitterness tolerable. The Egyptians had no direct medical contact with the Sumerians who came before them. The knowledge didn't travel in a straight line from one civilization to the next. They arrived at the same conclusion independently. The willow tree could fight pain, and they weren't the last civilization to figure this out on their own. By around 400 BC, on the rocky shores of ancient Greece, a physician named Hippocrates was writing texts on the island of Kos that would shape Western medicine for the next 2,000 years. Hippocrates, the man we still call the father of medicine, documented the use of willow bark tea for reducing fever and relieving the pain of childbirth. He recommended that patients chew the bitter bark directly or brew it into a warm drink, and he noted with some fascination how quickly the relief came on compared to other remedies available at the time. Women in labor were given willow bark tea to ease their suffering. Soldiers returning from battle were treated with it for wounds and fevers. His writings on willow bark spread across the Greek world and later traveled into the Roman Empire, where military physicians carried willow bark remedies in their leather field kits to treat wounded legionnaires on the dusty front lines of Rome's ever-expanding borders. Roman field hospitals, called valetudinaria, were set up near military camps across Europe and North Africa, and records suggest that willow-based treatments were among the standard supplies. The Roman army essentially ran one of the earliest large-scale medical distribution networks in history, and willow bark was part of the kit. And that wasn't even the part that got people's attention centuries later. The truly wild detail is what was happening on the other side of the planet at roughly the same time, with zero connection to any of this. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the dense forests and winding river valleys of North America, indigenous nations had been using willow bark for generations without any contact with anyone in Europe, Asia, or Africa. The Cherokee Nation brewed willow bark tea to treat headaches and fever along the rivers of the Appalachian Mountains. The Blackfoot people of the Great Plains chewed the inner bark for sore throats and mouth pain. The Iroquois Confederacy, in what is now upstate New York, made poultices from willow bark for joint pain, muscle aches, and the stiffness that came with long winters. They used different species of willow than their counterparts across the ocean, but the medicine was functionally the same. Different continents, different cultures, different languages, different centuries. The same tree, the same cure. And it wasn't just North America. Across the Pacific, in ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BC, medical texts attributed to the legendary emperor Shen Nong described willow bark preparations for pain and fever. These references appear in early versions of the Shenong Ben Cao Jing, one of the foundational texts of traditional Chinese medicine. Chinese physicians prescribed willow bark tea for joint inflammation and used willow leaf compresses for skin conditions. The knowledge eventually traveled along the Silk Road trading routes, blending with Persian and Arab medical traditions. That parallel discovery across civilizations that never communicated with each other is one of the most striking patterns in the entire history of medicine. It suggests something simple but profound. The willow tree's pain-killing properties were so obvious, so effective, and so universally accessible that virtually every culture living near one eventually figured it out. You didn't need a medical school. You didn't need a textbook. You just needed a toothache and a riverbank. The real question is what happened behind closed doors in the centuries that followed, because the story of how this ancient remedy almost disappeared is just as remarkable as how it was discovered. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Europe plunged into a period where the Catholic Church controlled most formal education and medicine. Monastery physicians practiced a narrow range of approved treatments rooted in the writings of Galen and a handful of other classical authorities. Many of the plant-based remedies that had sustained communities for millennia, willow bark among them, were dismissed as pagan superstition or outright witchcraft. If a village healer was found treating patients with tree bark and herbs rather than prayer and approved church remedies, the consequences could be severe. Willow bark didn't vanish entirely from the medieval European landscape, but it retreated into the shadows. Rural healers and village midwives kept using it quietly in the countryside, in places like the English Cotswolds, the French countryside near the Loire River, and the farming villages of Bavaria. They passed the knowledge from mother to daughter, from herbalist to apprentice, through oral tradition rather than written texts. For roughly 1,000 years, across medieval Europe, the willow bark remedy survived on the margins. It wasn't taught in the great universities of Bologna or Paris. It wasn't written into the formal medical canon. It was folk medicine, whispered about in thatched roof cottages and forest clearings, while the official medical establishment bled patients with leeches and prescribed mercury compounds for infections. In a few more centuries, the people who dismissed willow bark as peasant nonsense would be proven spectacularly wrong. The clock was already ticking. They just couldn't hear it yet. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Enter Reverend Edward Stone, an English clergyman living in the small village of Chipping Norton in the Oxfordshire countryside during the 1760s. Stone was not a physician. He was not a chemist. He was not a professor at any university. He was a vicar, a man of the church, whose primary job was delivering sermons on Sunday mornings and tending to the spiritual needs of his rural parish. But Stone was also deeply curious about the natural world around him, and one spring afternoon, in 1758, while walking along a riverbank near his village, he peeled a strip of bark from a white willow tree and tasted it. The sharp bitterness reminded him of something very specific. It tasted almost exactly like cinchona bark, the South American tree bark that produced quinine, which was the only known treatment for malaria at the time. Stone was familiar with a popular medical theory of the era called the doctrine of signatures. a widely held belief that God intentionally placed remedies for diseases near the places where those diseases occurred. Malaria came from swamps and marshlands. Cinchona grew near swamps. Fevers were common in damp, marshy areas. Willow trees grew in damp, marshy areas. The reasoning was that if the bitter willow tasted like the bitter cinchona, maybe it could treat fevers just as effectively. The logic was deeply flawed, but the conclusion was accidentally, spectacularly correct. Stone didn't rush to publish. He spent the next 5 years conducting something remarkably close to a real clinical trial, which was extraordinary for the 1760s when most medical claims were based on a handful of anecdotes at best. He collected willow bark, dried it in a baker's oven to remove the moisture, ground it into a fine powder, and administered it to roughly 50 patients suffering from fever and ague in his Oxfordshire parish. He carefully recorded the dosages, the timing, and the results. The fever came down, the pain receded. Patients recovered faster than those treated with the standard methods available at the time. And in 1763, Stone did something that changed the trajectory of medical history forever. He wrote a letter to the Earl of Macclesfield, who served as president of the Royal Society of London, describing his findings in precise, methodical detail. That letter, read aloud at a formal meeting of the Royal Society on April 25, 1763, was the first time in modern Western science that anyone had formally documented willow bark's medicinal effects with anything resembling systematic clinical evidence. Stone's letter was not dramatic. It was not filled with grand proclamations about changing the world. It was a country preacher writing politely to a nobleman about tree bark and parish patients, which, looking back, was either incredibly humble or incredibly understated, because that quiet letter essentially lit the match under the entire field of modern pharmacology. The scientific community across Europe took serious notice. Over the next several decades, chemists in Germany, France, and Italy began racing to figure out what exactly was inside willow bark that killed pain so effectively and reduced fever so quickly. They knew the remedy worked. Stone had proved that much. They just needed to isolate the specific compound responsible. In 1828, a German pharmacist named Johann Buchner, working in a university laboratory in Munich, became the first person to successfully extract the active ingredient from willow bark. He isolated a tiny amount of yellowish, needle-shaped crystals and named the compound salicin, derived from salix, the Latin word for willow. The quantity Buchner produced was small and somewhat impure, but it was a genuine milestone in the history of chemistry. For the first time in 5,000 years of human use, someone had separated the medicine from the tree. Just 1 year later, in 1829, a French pharmacist named Henri Leroux improved the extraction process dramatically in his workshop in Paris. Leroux developed a technique using boiling water and crystallization that produced much larger and significantly purer quantities of salicin from willow bark. His method made it possible to study the compound in meaningful amounts, and chemists across Europe began experimenting with it almost immediately. Then came a young Italian chemist named Raffaele Piria. Working in a laboratory in Paris in 1838, Piria figured out how to chemically convert salicin into a more potent compound he called salicylic acid. This was a breakthrough of enormous significance. Salicylic acid was a concentrated, effective painkiller and fever reducer that could be produced in a laboratory setting without needing entire cartloads of willow bark stripped from trees along European riverbanks. Doctors started prescribing salicylic acid almost immediately. And almost immediately, patients started reporting a serious problem. Salicylic acid worked brilliantly on pain and fever. That part was undeniable. But it also tore up the lining of the stomach and intestines with devastating efficiency. Patients who took it regularly developed severe nausea, intense vomiting, and in some cases, dangerous gastric bleeding. So the compound that had taken 5,000 years to pull from the willow tree basically punished you for swallowing it. Doctors found themselves trapped between two bad options. They had a drug that eliminated pain faster than almost anything else available in the 19th century, but the side effects were brutal enough that many patients flat out refused to take it a second time. Now, here's a detail that usually gets left out of this story. In 1853, a French chemist named Charles Frederick Gerhardt, working at a university laboratory in Strasbourg, actually succeeded in creating a modified version of salicylic acid. Gerhardt synthesized acetyl-salicylic acid, the exact compound that would later become aspirin. He documented the synthesis in his notes, but Gerhardt considered the process too cumbersome and the product too unstable to be worth pursuing commercially. He set it aside and moved on to other projects. Gerhardt died just 3 years later in 1856 at the age of 39, never knowing he'd held the formula for the most successful drug in history in his hands and walked away from it. For nearly 60 years after Piria's breakthrough, salicylic acid sat in this uncomfortable medical limbo, effective but punishing, a painkiller that caused its own kind of agony. Chemists across Europe tried modifying the compound, buffering it with other chemicals, mixing it with food or alkaline solutions. Nothing solved the stomach problem well enough to make it a drug people would take willingly. Everything salicylic acid had built as a reputation was about to work against it. Doctors were losing patience. Patients were refusing the pills. The compound that had taken 5 millennia to isolate from the willow tree was on the verge of being shelved permanently. Felix Hoffmann was 29 years old in the late summer of 1897 when he walked into his laboratory at the Bayer Chemical Company's facility in Elberfeld, a small industrial city in western Germany. Hoffmann was a trained chemist and a relatively junior researcher, low on the corporate ladder, at a company that was primarily known at the time for manufacturing industrial dyes, not medicines. But Hoffmann had a personal motivation that separated him from most of his colleagues working at their benches in that same building. His father suffered from severe rheumatoid arthritis that had worsened over the years. The pain in his joints was debilitating, and the standard treatment was sodium salicylate, a salt form of salicylic acid. It helped with the inflammation, but it wrecked his father's stomach so severely that the older man often couldn't eat for days after taking his medication. Felix Hoffmann watched this miserable cycle of relief and agony play out over months and years, and he decided to do something about it personally. On the 10th of August, 1897, Hoffmann successfully synthesized a chemically stable and pure version of acetyl-salicylic acid by adding an acetyl group to the salicylic acid molecule. The key distinction from Gerhardt's earlier attempt was that Hoffmann's process produced a stable, pure, reproducible compound suitable for mass manufacturing. He tested it on his father first, before any formal clinical trials took place. The pain relief came on fast, and for the first time in years, his father could take his medicine without the devastating stomach problems that had made every dose a miserable ordeal. Bayer's head of pharmacology, a man named Heinrich Dresser, ran formal clinical trials on the compound throughout 1898 at hospitals across Germany. The results were overwhelmingly positive. Acetyl-salicylic acid reduced fever, killed pain, and treated inflammation without the stomach destruction that had plagued salicylic acid for decades. On the 6th of March, 1899, Bayer registered the trademark name Aspirin with the Imperial Patent Office in Berlin. The name likely combined from acetyl and spirin from Spirso, the German word for salicylic acid that originally derived from the meadowsweet plant, Spirea ulmaria. Bayer launched it first as a powder sold in small paper packets to physicians and pharmacists, then quickly moved to the compressed, white tablet form that would become one of the most recognizable shapes in the entire history of medicine. And then Bayer did something that no pharmaceutical company had really done before. They marketed directly to ordinary people, not just doctors. They printed the Bayer Cross logo on every single tablet. They distributed free samples to hospitals and clinics across Europe and North America. They placed advertisements in newspapers and magazines that regular people read over breakfast. Within 5 years of its initial launch, aspirin was the best-selling drug on the planet, available in pharmacies from London to Buenos Aires to Tokyo. The company that started as a dye factory in Western Germany had essentially invented modern pharmaceutical marketing from scratch. And the tree bark remedy that Sumerian scribes had written about on clay tablets 5,000 years earlier was now sitting in medicine cabinets in tens of millions of homes worldwide. Aspirin's fate got tangled up in global politics in ways nobody at Bayer could have predicted. When World War I erupted in 1914, Bayer was a German company selling medicine to the Allied nations that were now at war with Germany. After the war ended, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 didn't just redraw the borders of Europe and impose crushing reparations on Germany. It also stripped Bayer of its aspirin trademark in the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Overnight, aspirin, with a lowercase a, became a generic term in those countries. Any pharmaceutical company anywhere could now manufacture and sell it under that name, without paying Bayer a single cent. The timing of that trademark loss collided with a global catastrophe. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919 swept across the planet and killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, making it one of the deadliest events in recorded human history. Doctors and nurses, overwhelmed and desperate for anything that might help, prescribed massive doses of aspirin to fight the brutal fevers that accompanied the virus. The recommended dosages at the time were far beyond what any modern physician would consider safe, sometimes reaching 8 to 30 grams per day. Some medical historians have since argued that aspirin overdoses may have contributed to a significant number of deaths during the pandemic, particularly among young, otherwise healthy adults whose symptoms worsened dramatically after taking extremely large doses. The aspirin didn't cause the flu, but it may have made the body's response to it more dangerous in certain patients. Despite the controversy, aspirin's reputation survived. By the 1920s and 1930s, it was a household staple in medicine cabinets on every continent. Factories around the globe were producing it by the ton. It was cheap. It was effective. It was available without a doctor's prescription in almost every country. The little white tablet that started its life as bitter tree bark, chewed by ancient farmers along a riverbank, had become the default answer to the most universal human complaint. Something hurts, and I want it to stop. But here's where the story takes one final, extraordinary turn. For over 70 years after Bayer launched aspirin, from 1899 all the way into the 1970s, nobody on Earth actually understood how it worked at a molecular level. Doctors knew it killed pain. They knew it reduced fever. They knew it fought inflammation. They prescribed it literally billions of times across those 7 decades. But they had absolutely no idea what the drug was actually doing inside the cells of the human body to produce those effects. They were flying blind with one of the most widely used substances in human history. In 1971, a British pharmacologist named John Vane, working at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, finally cracked the mystery that had stumped scientists for the better part of a century. Vane discovered that aspirin works by blocking the production of chemicals called prostaglandins. These are hormone-like substances that the body releases in response to injury, infection, or illness. Prostaglandins cause inflammation at the site of damage, amplify pain signals traveling to the brain, and trigger the fever response that makes you feel like you're burning from the inside out. Aspirin inhibits a specific enzyme called cyclooxygenase that is essential for prostaglandin production, effectively turning down the volume on the body's alarm system without shutting it off entirely. Vane's discovery didn't just explain how aspirin worked. It blew open an entirely new field of pharmacological research into the mechanisms of inflammation at the cellular and molecular level. His findings led directly to the development of a whole family of medications called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which now includes ibuprofen, naproxen, and dozens of other common painkillers found in pharmacies worldwide. Vane was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1982 for this work, and his research is still considered one of the most significant breakthroughs in 20th century pharmacology. The surprises kept coming, even after the Nobel ceremony in Stockholm. In the 1980s and 1990s, researchers discovered that low-dose aspirin could prevent blood clots by inhibiting platelet aggregation in the bloodstream. This meant aspirin was no longer just a painkiller or a fever reducer. It was a cardiovascular drug. Cardiologists began prescribing a small daily dose of aspirin to patients at elevated risk of heart attacks and strokes, turning a remedy that originated with ancient tree bark into a frontline tool in modern cardiac medicine. Clinical trials showed that for certain patient populations, daily low-dose aspirin therapy could reduce the risk of a first heart attack by a significant margin. Today, global production of aspirin exceeds 100 billion tablets per year. It remains on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, a catalogue of the most important medications needed in any basic health system anywhere in the world. Researchers in the 21st century continue studying aspirin for potential benefits against certain types of colorectal cancer, complications during high-risk pregnancies, and even preliminary investigations into neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. A drug that is over 125 years old in its modern pharmaceutical form and over 5,000 years old in its natural botanical one, is still producing new findings in laboratories from Boston to Berlin to Beijing. And the willow tree itself is still out there. You can find them growing along creeks and riverbanks and marshy lowlands in every temperate climate on Earth. The same tree that Sumerian scribes wrote about on clay tablets in Mesopotamia, that Hippocrates recommended to his patients on the island of Kos, that Cherokee healers brewed into tea in the Appalachian Mountains, that a curious English vicar tasted on an afternoon walk in the Oxfordshire countryside, and that a 29-year-old German chemist reformulated in a Bayer laboratory to help his aging father eat without pain. Still growing, still producing salicin in its bark, still waiting by the water. Hippocrates once wrote that the bark of the willow tree could ease suffering and calm a fever. 5,000 years after the first humans figured that out, we built an entire industry proving him right. If this story surprised you, subscribe. We cover forgotten histories like this one every week.